Hi there, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Thursday. Tonight, anger in America.
I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making.
The goal here is to make America safe, is what he said. There is no verifiable evidence that any of this is making America safer.
Minnesota's Democratic government clashing with the White House after 37-year-old Renee Nicole Macklingood was shot and killed by an ICE agent. We're going to bring you the very latest on that situation in moments. Then, trading with China. Prime Minister Mark Carney is about to head to China for the first visit by a Canadian Prime Minister in almost a decade. We're going to preview that trip with former Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques coming up. Plus, Trump's world.
We are going to take between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil.
The oil companies are going to go in and rebuild their system.
Nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland.
This was an act of domestic terrorism.
It's been a week, you could say, with major developments emanating from the White House that could have far-reaching impacts around the world, including right here in Canada. What exactly are those impacts? Our front bench is set to tackle that question tonight. Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement will all be here a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
This was an attack on federal law enforcement. This was an attack on law and order. This was an attack on the American people. The way that the media, by and large, has reported this story has been an absolute disgrace, and it puts our law enforcement officers at risk every single day. She was trying to ram this guy with her car. He shot back. He defended himself. He's already been seriously wounded in law enforcement operations before, and everybody who's been repeating the lie that this is some innocent woman who was out for a drive in Minneapolis when a law enforcement officer shot at her, you should be ashamed of yourselves.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance lashing out at the media as he took questions on the killing of a Minneapolis woman by an immigration agent yesterday. Here's a look at the reaction locally where people in Minneapolis are protesting the ICE crackdown on their city and what happened to 37-year-old Renee Nicole Macklingood.
It feels very, very difficult that we will get a fair outcome. And I say that only because people in positions of power have already passed judgment, from the president to the vice president to Kristi Noem, have stood and told you things that are verifiably false, verifiably inaccurate. They have determined the character of a 37-year-old mom that they didn't even know.
With us now to unpack what you just heard and what is happening in Minneapolis is our Washington Bureau Chief, Joy Melvin. Joy, good to see you. Thanks very much for making the time. What can you tell us about the situation in Minneapolis today following this deadly shooting?
This is a city on edge, Vashi. It's tense. People are angry. They are hurt. We've seen clashes erupt this morning, trying to block some of the ICE agents. There have been standoffs this afternoon. Pepper sprays being used. We've seen some kind of gas being used on protesters. It's very tense, as it has been for much of the day, these standoffs, after this massive vigil last night for Renee Good, the mother who was killed. Now, the governor is pleading with demonstrators to, quote, not take the bait, and to give Trump and the administration another reason to crack down further.
Let's talk a little bit about the administration, because we played that clip off the top of the show, and that was just, one moment from a very long press conference, kind of rare for the vice president to be in that room fielding those kinds of questions. But his opening soliloquy was really just, condemnation of the coverage, and also sort of, as we heard reference, like a very resolute, this was self-defense. What more can you tell us about how the White House is responding?
Yeah, listen, there are two contradictory versions of what happened. And even before the investigation has happened, even before the FBI has started to dive into the evidence, Homeland Security declared this was domestic terrorism. The president blamed the mother, Renee Good, saying that she behaved badly and that the officer was justified and shot her in self-defense. And then, of course, you played that clip from J.D. Vance, and he's going even further, blaming the media and what he calls the paid radical left. He even went so far to say that Renee Good was brainwashed. Starkly different and contradictory views. And Vashi, this is dividing America once again.
And it speaks also to the broader issue, right, which is the presence of ICE in a number of different cities and even federal law enforcement in different respects. In the case of Minnesota and Minneapolis, we heard there from Tim Walz, who viewers will, of course, be familiar with, was the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Kamala Harris, and just recently announced that he wasn't going to be running for the governorship again. But we've also heard from the Minneapolis mayor, which was the big, news yesterday, the way in which he described what had happened and what he wants to happen with ICE. What are we hearing from them today?
Yeah, I mean, local and state officials, they have been saying get ICE out, but of course Donald Trump has sent them in. You may have heard of that Somalia investigation, allegations of fraud. Donald Trump, there's no love lost here. Tim Walz is a Democrat, the governor there, Democrat officials, and yeah, they want ICE out to de-escalate the situation. Some 2,000 federal agents are there, and they're saying, what are you doing? You're going into our schools. You're terrorizing people. The governor has just authorized the National Guard to be put on standby to support local police and to help keep the peace and demonstrate peacefully. There are memories of George Floyd, who was murdered very nearby 6 years ago by a police officer, and these memories are very fresh in many people's minds. People are hurting and they're angry, and the governor doesn't want to give the Trump administration another reason to crack down, Vashi.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note, Joy. Thanks so much. That's our Washington bureau chief, Joy Malbin, for us. And you could see those pictures of a vigil, rather. Not only are there protests taking place in Minneapolis and more largely around Minnesota, but this is actually happening in Philadelphia. There's a number of cities where there are going to be vigils throughout the night. So we'll, of course, be sharing that coverage with you as the night progresses. What happens now, though, particularly in Minneapolis? Here to take a deeper dive into everything that is unfolding is our U.S. political analyst, Eric Ham, alongside our security analyst, Jean Meserve. Hello to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Eric, I'll start with you. We were just listening to some of the comments, very specific comments, I should say, from U.S. Vice President Vance around his version of events and sort of what he views as the misreporting of what occurred. What did you make of the way in which he kind of tried to counter what's out there?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is the tone and tenor still coming out of the administration is an us versus them mentality. And right now, what's happening on the ground, and more importantly, the video that everyone is seeing, is shaping narratives in a far more impactful way than what we're seeing from the administration. Add to that also the fact that now Congress is getting more involved in speaking out on these issues. And now we're beginning to see Republicans move away from the president on other salient issues. Makes clear that right now they're deeply concerned about what they're seeing, particularly from this administration, as to how it is engaging with its citizens.
Let's talk a little bit about the video in particular and the competing narratives about what happened, Jean, because I was watching some of your interviews as all of this was kind of breaking yesterday, and you were saying, look, we don't know for sure. We've got to take a closer look at the video. But what's interesting is 24 hours later, you've got these still two very different versions of events. Either it was self-defense or something completely different. Self-defense is the argument from the White House, and the state level and local level law enforcement are saying the opposite. How do you try and navigate that? What does the video tell you?
I think the video is a little ambiguous. I would like to see a slow motion version of it. I would like to hear the audio a little bit more clearly than I'm able to when I play it back online, because I think that's going to give us clues as to exactly how that officer was moving vis-a-vis the car. Did he step in front of it? It certainly appears that he was able to step to the side and appears to fire at least 2 shots from the side of the vehicle as opposed to being in front of the vehicle. All of that would seem to support the narrative that you're hearing from state and local officials, which was that this was unjustified and unnecessary. But the FBI is doing an investigation. We hope that it will be fair and impartial. State officials are concerned because there was a Minnesota law enforcement agency that was supposed to be involved in the investigation. Reports from Minnesota are that they have now been pushed to the side, and the FBI will be handling this exclusively.
Yeah, even there, if I could follow up with you on that point, because even there you've got, exactly as you said, right? In Minnesota, they're saying we're being blocked from taking part in this investigation, and then Kristi Noem saying we're not blocking them. This is exclusively FBI jurisdiction. Can you wade through that for us, if you don't mind?
I don't know the legal niceties, to be perfectly fair. It would seem to me, however, that in the interest of true transparency, and if you wanted to truly resolve the conflict around this issue, that you would welcome the participation of the local and state authorities as well as the FBI. As you well know, there have been many questions about the FBI under the leadership of Kash Patel, and whether in fact it is still an unbiased and uninfluenced law enforcement organization, or if it is something else.
A lot of questions as well, Eric, to Secretary Noem about whether or not, and the Vice President, about whether or not the severity of this, the reaction to it, the possibility of all these more protests would mean a retreat of ICE, for example, or a retreat of federal agents in the area. And her answer was essentially, emphatically, no. If anything, there will be a doubling down of the representation of ICE and federal law enforcement in that area and in other areas that they view as, so-called trouble spots when it comes to immigration. What does that say to you?
Well, that's typical for the administration, that even when there's a crisis and it's a crisis that perhaps looks as though it's detrimental to the ICE agents on the ground, we never see a retreat from those agents or even from the administration, or even a way of somehow trying to tamp down on the tensions. What we see is a continuation of those policies, of the aggression by the administration, and of course a continuation of fanning the flames. Where this also, I think, becomes deeply problematic is when you look at the actual policy of the DHS when it comes to issues like this regarding moving vehicles. The policy specifically does not state that an officer should draw his weapon or fire into a vehicle. It says that an agent should actually avoid the vehicle and get out of the way. So even when you look at the policies coming from the DHS itself, Kristi Noem doesn't really address those policies other than to continue to villainize the victim herself. And I think that's where we're seeing so much tension, so much angst, particularly from the community itself.
On that same question, Jean, of sort of the broader presence of ICE, both in Minnesota but elsewhere, and federal agents, I know that there have been a number, for example, of the National Guard, and I believe if you are still in Washington, I know you were in Washington yesterday. You've covered Homeland Security for years. Like, how unusual is the situation many of these states find themselves in at the moment?
This is a totally different situation. It's been some time since I was directly involved in covering the Department of Homeland Security, but I did several stories with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There were concerns then about the level of cooperation from some local police departments and whether or not they were turning over to ICE people who had been accused of crimes. So it has been a total transformation. And ICE itself has lowered its standards and has reduced training, we're told, although we've not been given much specific information about what kind of training they're receiving. And they've been on a massive hiring spree. So a lot of questions about the quality of both the personnel and the training that they're receiving. And let me also say, this is a feud that's been going on for some time. Between the state of Minnesota and the federal government. You may recall that several months ago there was a Minnesota lawmaker who was gunned down along with her husband, and there were not appropriate expressions, some felt, of sympathy and empathy from the federal government. And contrasts were drawn between that and the reaction to the assassination of the conservative leader Charlie Kirk. In addition, you have a governor who was part of the Kamala Harris presidential ticket that Trump ran against. So there is a long-seated tension between that particular state and the federal government.
On that note, Eric, last question to you. We've been observing protests all day. Those protests are expected to expand to other cities as well. What is your sense of the degree to which people who are living in these affected communities are going to push back against the presence of ICE?
Well, I think we're going to see more, not less, of these demonstrations. In fact, if you look at the recently inaugurated mayor of New York, Zohran Mamdani, he came out very strong against these ICE agents, and we don't see them to the level in New York that we are in other places, particularly like Chicago or maybe Los Angeles. But I think what you're now beginning to see is this massive, massive groundswell, not only from people in their respective communities, but also from local leaders who are continuing to push back. And that's now beginning to resonate in Congress, where now you're actually seeing the unthinkable, where you have members who are talking about actually curtailing or curbing the budgets of many of these agencies as a result of what they're seeing on the streets in these cities.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. I appreciate both of you making the time for your analysis this evening. Thank you so much. Jean Meserve and Eric Ham. That's just one of the big stories this week emanating from the White House. We're going to unpack all of them and their consequences around the world and for Canada with our front bench in just a little bit on the show. Christy Clark, Marco Medicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement will all be here. Before that, though, I want to turn to another developing story, this one over in Iran, where protests are significantly growing in size and scope. The Associated Press is reporting phone and internet lines have been cut in the country after exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi called for a mass demonstration. The streets of Tehran were full overnight, as you can see right there on the screen, following that call. Protests originally began more than a week ago, following the collapse of Iran's currency and widespread economic devastation. These are the biggest protests in Iran since 2022, when 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was killed while in police custody after being arrested for not wearing her hijab properly. The Canadian government saying today Canada is deeply concerned by reports of attacks on hospitals in Alam and Tehran, including assaults on medical staff and the wounded. Canada calls on Iranian authorities, the government writes, to protect all hospitals and their patients and to respect the fundamental rights of the Iranian people to protest safely and peacefully. We'll take a quick break here on Power Play. After that break, the Prime Minister is headed to China. We're going to take a closer look at some of the expectations ahead of that trip with former Canadian Ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques, next.
If the Prime Minister starts to back down on those 100% EV tariffs, what impact would that have on Ontario's EV industry? And what are you telling the Prime Minister about those tariffs?
Well, we can't back down. Simple as that. They want to come and open a big manufacturing facility and employ Unifor employees. Well, let's talk. But don't be shipping cars in, not manufactured by Ontarians. And Hyundai, it's a shout out to you. And Kia. We buy 220,000 cars here in Ontario and Canada. You got to open a plant.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford with a plea for the Prime Minister ahead of Mark Carney's upcoming state visit to China, as the Prime Minister seeks new markets to offset our increasingly unreliable American trading partner. It's something his predecessor also tried nearly a decade ago when then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sought new trade agreements with China's Xi Jinping. Those talks did not end up materializing in a deal, and a lot sure has happened in the interim. Can the Prime Minister expect a different reception from Xi? Joining us now is Guy Saint-Jacques, who was Canada's ambassador to China during Trudeau's first trip to China back in 2016. Hi, Mr. Saint-Jacques. A pleasure to see you as always. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for the invitation.
I'll start off where the Premier of Ontario left off and just ask you what you think of the prospects of some sort of a deal or agreement being struck to remove those EV tariffs in exchange for the removal of tariffs on canola and other agricultural products.
Well, I can tell you that I had discussions in Ottawa late last year where I was told that there would have to be trade-offs. And of course, what I understood from that was that in exchange for lifting or reducing the tariffs on electric vehicles from China, that the Chinese would do the same thing on canola. But in fact, I think the Prime Minister Carney is quite concerned about further problems that we could have with Donald Trump, and he knows that Donald Trump has said that the United States don't need Canadian cars, and therefore one possible solution to keep Ontarians working would be to invite a Chinese EV car manufacturer to come to Canada, and the arrangement could be similar to the one that GM Canada struck when it went to Shanghai a number of years ago to build a plant, whereby we would tell the Chinese that after 3 years, 30% of the components of these cars has to be Canadian, and after 10 years it would be 100%. And so in case that things further deteriorate with the United States, well, we would have a good quality car that would be built in Canada that would ensure employment. So, I think we are at a stage where probably we will see also further developments in terms of Chinese investment in Canada to try to clarify the rules. And the Prime Minister knows that we need to attract more investment from abroad.
Tell me a little bit about your assessment, though, of that tightrope walk that you mentioned off the top. And that is, we're at this very kind of tenuous point with the United States, impactful point with regards to trade negotiations there and the upcoming review of CUSMA. But at the same time, it's obvious, I think, to all Canadians that we need to seek out new markets. And China, from an economic perspective, at the very least, is an obvious choice for that. How do you walk that balancing act? How do you balance those two things, trying to maintain the relationship with the United States and strike a deal there, while at the same time pursue something that we know Donald Trump considers, a country that we know Donald Trump considers an adversary?
You're right, and this is a very delicate balance that the Prime Minister has to strike. But I would say on this, he has been quite clear that there will be a number of areas that will be off-bound in our relationship with China, everything that is related to national security, and he has mentioned the Arctic, artificial intelligence. And I would say that in a way, going to Beijing and signing agreements, announcing deals, could be helpful in terms of the upcoming renegotiation of CUSMA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in as much that it would demonstrate to the U.S. president that, in fact, yes, we are heavily dependent on the American market, but we also can ship our oil, our natural gas to China, for instance. They would buy everything that we would ship to them. And last year, a good part of the increase on our exports was oil, and now that liquefied natural gas will start to be shipped, I think they will be a big buyer. But of course, any agreement will be scrutinized in Washington, and we'll have to see. But I'm confident that the Prime Minister Carney could explain to Donald Trump that he does this for the same reasons that Donald Trump will be going to China in April. It's to protect jobs, help farmers to sell their canola, and fishermen in Atlantic Canada sell their lobsters.
And I do understand your point and the Prime Minister's, that our approach will be, one that in essence tries to compartmentalize, right? That in essence tries to say, we're still concerned about national security, but we're just going to have this bucket here of amplified trade that we hope to pursue. The person who keeps reminding me that though we may want to compartmentalize, China does not view things that way is, in fact, Michael Kovrig, who has said that in nearly every interview I've conducted with him, who was, of course, one of the two Michaels alongside Michael Spavor who were detained by China. What is your view on China's approach to that? Like, if we may want to approach this from a compartmentalized way, will they?
Yeah. Well, in fact, it doesn't need to be that way, because, the Prime Minister will be making an official visit, and he will have quite a bit of time. We don't know exactly how much time he will spend in Beijing and whether he will go to other cities, but I expect that he will have a day and a half of official meetings in Beijing. The fact that he is perceived as a serious, competent leader, contrary to our previous leader, he is a known quantity by the Chinese leaders. They met with him when he was in the private sector, when he went to China in 2024. I think this allows him to have very frank discussions on sensitive issues. One, for instance, where I expect the Prime Minister to be very clear on our own red lines concern Chinese interference in Canadian life. On that, I think for the Prime Minister to be seen in his efforts to recalibrate the relationship with China, he has to reassure the Canadians that he is taking seriously all those allegations, that in fact there will be zero tolerance for further Chinese interference or Chinese spying in Canada. And I expect him also to raise in private, in a respectful way, tough issues related to human rights in Xinjiang, in Tibet, but also the case, for instance, of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. And the Chinese will appreciate all this. So, in my view, one does not exclude the other, and the Prime Minister can make a case why it's useful to China. And by the way, China needs an international system that functions. The 20% of their GDP comes from exports, so they need this to continue. But the Prime Minister can impress on them that they have to become what I would call a better global citizen, respect the rules, and finally deliver on the commitments they made to open their markets when they joined the World Trade Organization back in 2001. So I expect quite a bit of progress on a number of fronts. And yes, officially we will see, I expect, a number of announcements related to those tariffs and various areas of where we can work together. But, there will be other discussions for sure taking place in Beijing.
Okay, I have to leave it on that note, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Thanks for your time, as always, and your analysis. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Guy Saint-Jacques was Canada's ambassador to China. The Prime Minister will also be heading to Davos, Switzerland, in addition to China and Qatar next week. CTV News will have full coverage from the ground throughout that entire trip. Still ahead tonight on Power Play, we're going to bring in the front bench. It has been a week, you could say. A lot of stuff emanating from the White House. We're going to talk about the impact of that with Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement. There they are. They're back with me in just 2 minutes.
Well, they have oil that is stuck in Venezuela. They can't move it because of our quarantine and because it's sanctioned. We are going to take between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil.
The oil companies are going to go in and rebuild their system. They're going to spend billions of dollars, and they're going to take the oil out of the ground, and we're taking back what they sold.
The real question is, by what right does Denmark assert control over Greenland? For the United States to secure the Arctic region, to protect and defend NATO and NATO interests, obviously Greenland should be part of the United States.
You have a woman who aimed her car at a law enforcement officer and pressed on the accelerator. Nobody debates that. I can believe that her death is a tragedy, while also recognizing that it's a tragedy of her own making.
It's difficult to understate the impact of Donald Trump's last 6 days, starting this past weekend with the capture of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro, then a push to purchase Greenland from Denmark, and now domestic upheaval after the killing of a Minneapolis woman during an immigration crackdown. Here to unpack what it means for a changing world, and more specifically for Canada, is our front bench. With me tonight, former BC Premier Christy Clark. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Marco Mendicino is former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Mark Carney and a former Liberal cabinet minister. He's now a senior counsel and strategic advisor for Castles. CTV political analyst and former Conservative Industry Minister James Moore is with us tonight. He's now a policy advisor at Edelman. And Tony Clement served in senior roles in Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper's cabinet. He's now CEO of Tony Clement International. Hi, everybody. Good to see you tonight. I know that there's a lot of different stories there, and certainly probably the one out of Venezuela. We can have a discussion about the impact here in Canada in a moment. But as you put all of that together in the aggregate, James, what has been going through your mind? What is the key takeaway, do you think, from this week?
Well, and it's Thursday, and believe it or not, the week is still young, because right now, as we're talking, there's chaos unfolding in Iran as there's a pushback against the regime. And tomorrow, it looks like the U.S. Supreme Court may rule on Donald Trump's tariff policy. So the chaos is going to endure. I think the politics of this, on the one hand, for the Democratic Party is to try to find a way to not just be the anti-Trump party, but to show that there's common reason on the horizon in the midst of all this chaos. The two things that I take away, though, about the sort of the reaction to all of these events in the United States that I observed as a Canadian. One is that there seems to be no check or balance whatsoever on Donald Trump, not on the congressional side, not within the Republican Party, which is now just a MAGA party, not within his own administration. There was a little bit of a pushback today. Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, pushing back on Stephen Miller's comments that you showed just there. Some Republicans in the Senate, Josh Hawley, Murkowski, Collins, Senator Rand Paul, all pushing back on Donald Trump's approach to Venezuela and foreign policy. There's a little bit of a line there. But the shooting in Minnesota then showed the second thing that I observe about American society right now is that there was an awful event that happened in Minnesota. And there's some debate, a little bit of a debate about what exactly happened there when that woman rolled forward with her truck. You would think that maybe half of Republicans and half of Democrats would see the story one way and the other. But unfortunately, politics, in spite of video evidence, if you support Donald Trump, you seem to believe that that woman was attacking the ICE agent. If you don't like Donald Trump, you seem to believe that that woman was murdered. That even politics, in the face of objective evidence that a woman was shot in cold blood in the streets of Minneapolis, that even people can't have an objective opinion about a clear event that happened on video, that politics has to infect people's interpretation of an objective fact of which there's video evidence, which means that it's a really dark time, frankly, in America, that we can't have debates about obvious things in spite of video evidence without politics staining people's views of things. And that's a really dark thing to have to say out loud.
On the first point that James made, Christy, this idea that there is so little pushback to what Trump is doing, this week really seemed emblematic of that. And I think of all the things that he has said, for example, even where Greenland and Denmark are concerned, and how even at the top of the week I had guests on saying, oh, it's probably not going to happen, it's not too likely. Like, in your view, how literally should we be taking him at this moment in time?
Well, you can't take him anything but literally. I mean, he did invade, or they did go down to Venezuela and kidnap the leader. Now, he wasn't a legitimate leader. He'd stolen the election. He's a gangster. He's supported by the narcotics business. Not a terrible thing that Maduro's not in power anymore, but nonetheless, America has shown that it is not going to adhere to a rules-based order in the world anymore. And I think, for me, when I look at that, I think, okay, it's good that America wants to be involved in the world again. That's a plus. But it's not a good thing that America doesn't want to live up to any of the rules-based order. And so when you go from Venezuela to Greenland and you start thinking about, well, wait a minute, Denmark is a part of NATO. Denmark is one of our allies and an American ally. Is it possible that Greenland will be, I mean, if Venezuela is the 51st state now, is it possible that Greenland will become the 52nd state? So, I mean, we're kind of, Canada's sort of moving down the list of the next states that Donald Trump wants to claim, but it's not. I don't think Canadians should be at all happy about the direction this is going in. We need to protect NATO at this moment in time, as much as we need to do anything else in terms of our international obligations to each other. And what has happened in Venezuela, I don't think bodes well for NATO and for us supporting a world order that's going to make sure that we're able to prevent really, I think, really terrible events around the world. But I will just say this, it's true that Americans are divided. There's no doubt about it. But I think there is a big middle in the United States that is listening to things like Donald Trump talk about how, Rob Reiner, well, I mean, who's really going to miss him? He didn't like me. I think that's affected a lot of people's view of his character. And I think that the way that the Republicans are handling this situation in Minnesota with the ICE officer is, again, eating away at people's sense that Donald Trump is trying to always do the right thing. I think, yep, there's people on the right, people on the left you will never persuade. I'm coming to you from America today, and I can tell you, down here there are a lot of people that just don't like what they're seeing. They're a big middle bunch of people, and when the midterms come up, and James has talked about this a number of times, I don't think that the Republicans are going to get what they hope out of that election.
Do you think that Trump cares about that, Marco?
Well, I certainly think he is paying very close attention to to everything that's going on. I just go back to your opening clips where you laid out the events of the last week. And, to that, James added Iran and the impending court decision around the IEEPA tariffs. And so if that wasn't enough, there's just a lot to unpack. And, as a Canadian, I think there are a few things that we can take away from the last week and Trump. And that is his administration is prepared to move fast, assertively, and with decisions that are very much coming from the center of that administration. And so in Canada, like, our contrast has to be to continue to be steady and to be composed, because so many of those events we cannot control, and we can rattle through them. But beginning with the agonizing events that have unfolded in Minnesota as a result of the killing of what seems to be an innocent woman, a mother of three. I mean, just gut-wrenching. And the protests that are following. To the invasion and incursion resulting in the capture of Maduro, who is a bad man. I mean, let's make no bones about it. I mean, this is a guy who's got an egregious track record when it comes to human rights violations, and I doubt very much anybody will shed a tear if they've got any compassion in their hearts for the victims of those transgressions. But what does it mean for Canada and for trade? And then moving to the statements and the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Greenland and what that means for NATO. I mean, it's just overwhelming. It feels like we've just lived the final episode of Stranger Things, and we're living in the upside down. And what we want is some sense of serenity and logic and reason. And I have to say that, when I see the Prime Minister go abroad and, stand shoulder to shoulder with our allies and try to be a bit of a center of gravity to all of that, I mean, I think that's where the steadiness and the calmness has to be. And as Canadians, I mean, I think we have to really rally around each other and control what we can control. And that is going to be difficult in this year, but we've damn well better try.
Tony, I'll give you the last word on that.
Yes. First of all, the final episode of Stranger Things, Marco, was when the upside down disappeared. But anyway, other than that, your analogy was great.
That's my optimism.
But no, a lot to unpack here, Vashi, as everybody's been saying. Obviously, we saw near the end of last year the publishing of the strategy, the strategic paper of the Trump administration. Out of that came what has been known as the Don Road Doctrine, like the Monroe Doctrine, but now it's Donald Trump. And obviously, the United States is saying this hemisphere, we're going to be taking charge in this hemisphere. So we're seeing some of the results of that for sure. On Venezuela, can I just make this point? Because if this was George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or somebody like that, they would have gone in and taken out Maduro, like they did with Noriega in Panama decades ago, and then they would have done regime change, right, to get the democratically elected. Trump didn't do that, and at first I was quite worried about that. But let me just flip this over to the upside down, Marco, and say, you know what? That didn't work in Iraq, didn't work in Afghanistan, hasn't really worked for the United States to do wholesale regime change. Maybe it is better for the time being to decapitate Maduro, keep that government in charge for the time being, have a more languid and slower transition to democracy, which is what I think we all want, but not do it like in 24 hours, which is what the United States has been doing for the last few decades. Maybe this is better for Venezuela and better for the world. Maybe Trump was showing restraint in doing that. I'm just putting that out there. I guess the proof will be in the pudding. For Greenland, I share the concerns of the panel. I think that Trump, if given the opportunity, would gobble up the real estate, as a real estate mogul would do. But there's other contending forces that are in play that are not in play in Venezuela or elsewhere, and that has to do with NATO and the NATO countries standing up for a sovereign nation like Denmark. So things are complicated for Trump. I know that the general feeling is he can do whatever he wants. I'm not sure he can do whatever he wants. And last time I was in the United States was in Washington in December. There were a number of Republican congressmen who spoke at a conference I was at. They were all saying things that Donald Trump would not want to hear about the importance of NATO, the importance of allies. These are Republican congressmen. Now, hopefully they've got the guts to say that a little bit more loudly rather than at an international conference. But those people still exist.
Yeah, that's the central question, whether they say it somewhere else. I got to take a quick commercial break. Everybody is sticking around. We're going to talk about the prospect of that Supreme Court decision tomorrow. Next with the Front Bench. Stay right there. Welcome back to Power Play. Who remembers this press conference moment? Ontario Premier Doug Ford, back in September, pouring out a bottle of Crown Royal after the announcement that an Ontario bottling plant was being shuttered. But Crown Royal has also long been made in Manitoba, and the Premier's promise to pull it from Ontario shelves has angered Manitoba Conservative MP James Bazan, who wrote in part on social media, "Every drop of Crown Royal is made in Gimli, Manitoba, using Manitoba grains and pure Interlake water. Our farmers and Crown Royal employees in Gimli are proud of their award-winning whiskey, Canada's #1 spirits export. If you go ahead with your threats, don't be surprised if Manitoba pulls Ontario wine from our liquor markets."
Oh, I talk to Wab frequently. I talked to him the other day, actually yesterday, I think, the day before. Either way, I think the world of the guy. He's an absolute champion. He understands I got to protect jobs here. But I also informed him this is all going down to Alabama. There was an article from the union, Unifor. They know it's going down to Alabama. So whatever we're producing here in Ontario, they're going to make up the difference in Manitoba or Quebec. So I got to protect Ontario as he wants to protect Manitoba, but he's a great guy.
Let's bring back our front bench, Christy Clark, Marco Mendicino, James Moore, and Tony Clement. Christy, I'll start with you on this one. What happened to, breaking down all the internal trade barriers and Team Canada? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Crown Royal makes an excellent replacement for bourbon in your Manhattan, if that's what you're making in your bar or getting in the bar these days. I have to say, I've been enjoying going back to Crown Royal after years of drinking American bourbon. So I think, it would be great if we could get this resolved. And I think, I like Doug Ford. I think he's been a great fighter for Canada, but I don't think he's right on this one. We should be supporting jobs in other provinces across the country. So there's a couple of questions here. One, why is it that governments are still selling liquor in Canada? Why don't we have a system where it's the private sector that's deciding whether or not they're going to get certain kinds of liquor and sell certain kinds of liquor, depending on what customers actually want? If governments want a tariff, goods coming into the country, fair enough, governments can do that. But governments should not be deciding what we get to drink and what's available in our liquor stores because they happen to decide that the public sector should be owning that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is premiers have to decide that they're going to give some things up in order to get something greater. If there is one impediment in the way of Mark Carney's plan for Canada, which I support, diversifying our economy and diversifying our customers around the world, it's that the provinces have to do their bit and get out of the way of each other. That means we have to get rid of those interprovincial trade barriers. I was at the table negotiating that for years. In the time that I was Premier of British Columbia, and what happened every time we'd get close to a deal and then one province or another would trip over something, often something not that important to the economy overall, and the whole thing would fall apart. They have to do better, and we are in a moment of crisis for the country. We're confronting really existential challenges for our economy. And the Prime Minister cannot do this alone. He needs the premiers to come together, and Doug Ford has been a leader on this. I would say, Premier Ford, I think it's a moment for you to stand up and really try and do something that's going to be maybe not in your own best interest in your own province, but it's going to be good for the country because we really, really need that kind of action now.
Well, the comments today, Tony, reminded me of all of that momentum that was behind. Every province was saying just 6-7 months ago, it's all good. We're gonna take them all down. It's gonna be $200 billion of extra economic activity. That has not come to fruition.
No, I think James and I on your panel can both show you the scars of trying to do something on reducing interprovincial trade barriers as federal ministers, and weren't completely successful by any stretch. So yeah, I mean, that's the question. Where's the urgency that we had 7-8 months ago, where everybody was talking a good game about interprovincial trade barriers going by the wayside, and there were lots of discussions going on and so forth. Doug Ford, to his credit, did sign some deals with Nova Scotia and other provinces, saying, look, you know, if they reduce their barriers, we'll automatically reduce our barriers. So that there is a little bit of momentum on that, but certainly not enough to create a unitary economy, which is what we desperately need in the face of the Trump tariffs. So, yeah, I would like this Crown Royal issue to go away. I think you can say both sides are right in a sense, that Doug Ford and that plant moved to Alabama, but the Gimli plant is a great plant and producing a great product. But none of this is going to get you anywhere unless we act as a unitary nation when it comes to interprovincial trade and look out for the Canadian interests.
The bigger issue, Marco, is of course, what's happening when it comes to trade with the United States. And we mentioned in the last segment that decision from the Supreme Court could come as soon as tomorrow. There seems to be a lot of analysis out there, given the line of questioning from the justices, that it could go against Donald Trump. If it does, what kind of impact do you think that potentially has on Canada's negotiating position heading into the USMCA review?
Marginal, and I hate to throw cold water on what could be an otherwise positive result, in the sense that if the Trump administration fails to persuade the Supreme Court to uphold its IEEPA tariffs, which, for the benefit of your viewers, are those tariffs that were connected to the fentanyl crisis at the border, I still think that there are many other options which the Trump administration could resort to, including 232 and 301 tariffs. So, I don't want to overstate it, and I don't want to understate it. I think if the Supreme Court rules against, and again, just to crystallize what I think the legal question is, the IEEPA legislation doesn't make any explicit reference to the words tariff or tax. It refers to the federal government's power, the president's power to be able to regulate importation. And the question is really whether or not Congress gave the president the power to do what he did, which is to put in place these tariffs. And so we'll see. But I'll come back to the bigger picture. What I don't think we want are the unintended effects of premiers kind of prosecuting this case and then sort of getting caught between the crosshairs on it. I do think it's important that all premiers, as much as possible, understand the puts and takes, as Christie was talking about, when it comes to negotiating the best possible deal going forward. And, I think the Prime Minister has done a good job using the forum of the First Minister's meetings, which he should continue to do, to really make sure that as much as possible we are presenting as one front in solidarity, because in doing so, I think that maximizes our negotiating position. And just lastly, I'm +1 with Christie as well on the Crown Royal. Tony, we want the we want the Crown Royal issue to go away, but we don't want the Crown Royal to go away altogether. So.
Yeah. I'm glad I formulated this panel so I could understand everyone's true drinking taste. It feels very worthwhile. James, I'll hand the last word over to you. I'll ask both questions that we were discussing, kind of your position on where the provincial delineating lines are resting at this moment in time, but also your thoughts on the potential impact of the decision should it come tomorrow.
Yeah, if I have to choose between Team Ford and Team James Bazan, I'm on Team James Bazan. The reason why the provinces do this is two reasons. One is because of money, and two, because premiers get to pour out bottles of Crown Royal and look like a tough guy, but without not actually addressing the issue. So there you are. But Marco's right. The bigger issue is what happens in the United States. If the IEEPA tariffs are struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, straight away, the U.S. stops collecting that tariff revenue. So that's a win. However, there's a real problem because the money then has to be reimbursed, and there's no way to know how that's going to ever actually be done and how many years that would take, number two. Number three is then that would reassert Congress's ability to impose tariffs and take it away from the president. What that would mean then in an election year in the United States is that you will now have Republican and Democrat candidates for Congress running for Congress expressly saying that they're going to be tough guys and collect tariff revenue and try to get as many Canadian industries taken out of the Canada-U.S. trade agreement so that they can be tariffed, so that the conversation about CUSMA then becomes less, frankly, a Donald Trump Canada issue and more of now a broader political issue with both the Republican and Democratic parties. So the long tail on the decision tomorrow could result in the United States getting more aggressive on CUSMA and trying to get more industries taken out from the trade agreement so that they could be subject to tariffs that would then be imposed by Congress, which are much harder to undo because you would then probably have bipartisan support to go after different sectors of the Canadian economy. So the trade conversation could get extraordinarily more complex if the decision tomorrow goes against President Trump, which means that we're going to be talking about trade for a long time through the rest of calendar 26.
And Vashi, if I may, just to pick up, because I think James really encapsulated the three themes that I think that we can take away from the last week, which is that this is an administration that's going to go fast, it's going to be assertive, and it's going to be very centralized when it comes to taking those decisions. And our response to that has to be, very calibrated and composed.
Okay, I have to leave it on that note. I am flat out of time for tonight's show, but I appreciate all of you making the time, and I appreciate your analysis tonight. Christy Clark, Tony Clement, James Moore, and Marco Mendicino, our front bench. Thank you so much, everyone. And we were, of course, talking about the Supreme Court decision from the United States, which could come, as I characterize it, as early as tomorrow. That's the first day for the release of decisions from the Supreme Court, and they heard that case last November. The anticipation was at the time that they could even perhaps release the decision, before the end of the year. So this is the first opportunity that they would be able to release that decision. So we will stay tuned for that. Of course, if it does come tomorrow morning, we will have full coverage and reaction right here on CTV News Channel. We also have a lot more coverage of the Prime Minister's trip to China. It will be a multi-city trip. He will also be heading to Qatar, I believe the first visit of a Canadian Prime Minister to Qatar. And he will also be heading to Davos, Switzerland for the WEF forum there. President Donald Trump is expected as well. I'll leave Power Play there. Have a wonderful rest of your night. Thanks for watching.